You know, what strikes me very much about your story is it was so random how it all started, so unfair. This was exposure to nerve agents which changed your life. And you could very easily sink into really total misery about a total change like that. So can you tell us, please, how do you actually cope with having ME-CFS and the effects of these other conditions? How do you find meaning in these difficulties?
Well, as somebody that's had Tourette's syndrome since I was 5 years old, I was used to doctors, I've had Tourette's syndrome since 1972, 73. I have had doctors during the 70s and 80s. It was we didn't know what it was. I was always misdiagnosed up until I was in my teenage years. And there was a television show, Quincy ME, that actually showed the world what Tourette's syndrome was. And for the first time, people realized he's telling the truth. But I had to learn how to be okay with the fact that doctors can be wrong. So in 2006, when I got sick, and I knew they weren't believing me, I knew they weren't hearing me, I didn't internalize it in a way that was destructive. I was familiar with being misdiagnosed with a neurological challenge. So I was able to handle it better. When I was younger, I did not handle things well. People with Asperger's, people with ADHD, people with OCD, and then Tourette's syndrome, I had all four of them. I overblew things. I did not handle things the way I should have handled them. But over time, I learned how to handle them. I learned to grow up. I learned to own the condition. And that was the biggest thing is once I learned to manage Asperger's, OCD, ADHD, Tourette's, I was able to get a hold of my life, and my life changed dramatically. I went from living on the streets to being quite successful. And so when the ME-CFS situation presented itself, I knew the importance and the value of owning a condition. It's not fair that people get sick, but I was actually grateful that I'm the one that got sick and it wasn't other people, because I knew how to handle this. I had been through the wars. So when I got sick, I just knew how to handle it and how not to handle it. And, I think that's been a huge mistake with so many people. They are not understanding you got to take responsibility for whatever cards you're dealt. If you're an adult and you become blind because of an accident in adulthood, you got to learn to be blind. You got to accept being blind, and you got to find a way to overcome the challenge that is yours. I use a saying, and I use this with the people I work with. I say, it's your life. It's my life. It's my responsibility. At the end of the day, all these people can care all they want, but it's up to the individual, absolutely their responsibility to figure out what they have to do to overcome whatever challenge presents themselves.
So, what you're talking about there, Ray, is the importance of, as a position in life, radically accepting what actually happens to you and basing your life on reality. Now, that doesn't mean that you're being fatalistic, but it does mean that you have to say, this is actually the situation, and how can I deal with it? And right. There's the human temptation when things are going pretty awful, which is that we don't do that, and instead we become a victim.
The one thing that I also did that was important, I avoided the medications. When I knew the doctors weren't trusting or believing anything I was saying, when they were prescribing the antipsychotics, the antidepressants, the anti-anxieties, the anti-everythings, I didn't argue with them. I just didn't fill them. When they wrote the prescriptions, I just took them, but I never actually filled the prescriptions. And, so my experience with this condition has always been from a drug-free standpoint. In addition to having Tourette's, acute motor axon neuropathy, myalgic encephalomyelitis, I've also undergone 30 major operations. Both my hips, shoulders, knees are all prosthetics. My spine is fused. I've had 2 major prosthetic infections. One lasted for 2.5 years. And to this day, I don't take any pain meds. I don't take any antidepressants. I don't take anything like that. I take a heart pill. I take a pill for kidney stones, and I take an injection for the infection that I have to live with from the prosthetics. I just use movement as my pain relief. I don't lay down and stay down. My life, even though people think when they watch some of my videos that I'm out and about doing a lot of things, they think I'm not severe with this condition. What I don't actually tell people on these videos is that out of a 24-hour day, so I'm spending 20 hours per day in a vertical position. But during those 4 hours, I'm getting things done because I'm planning ahead of what I need to do. I'm not doing 4 straight hours worth of anything. I might do 30 minutes worth of something, but then I have to go lay down again. I've just learned that the best thing I can do in my situation is to find the balance between resting and moving. In the ME-CFS community, there's this big confusion about what is exercise. People think jogging is exercise, going to the gym is exercise. I had to rethink what exercise was. To me, getting the trash bag out of the trash can is exercise. Getting up and going to get my own drink is exercise. When I need something to drink, I'm not ringing a bell, not asking my wife to do it. I am physically making myself get up and go over and do it. Because every time I move, I'm releasing critical chemicals into my system naturally that are having lasting beneficial improvement.